welcome to Understanding the Business Environment. This week, we're going to be talking about the macroeconomy, and we have with us the Chief Economist in Markets and Head of Research at NAB, Ivan Colhoun, who will be discussing a lot of these issues with us, and we're very, very lucky to have him. So thank you very much, Ivan, for coming along.
Thanks for having me along.
So before the camera started, you and I started chatting about sort of our career paths, and I think you've had a very interesting one, and I wanted to see whether you could share that with some of our students.
I then went and worked for the Reserve Bank, which I certainly recommend to people that are interested in really the macroeconomy. And then I joined Deutsche Bank. I worked there for nearly 15 years, but then I was into planes, so Qantas advertised for a chief economist, and I applied for that role and was fortunate enough to get that. So that was a really applied type of use of my economics degree. And then I ended up back in banking, and I've been with NAB for the last 8 years, and certainly the last 3 years have been very, very interesting and challenging to interpret what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanna touch on the last 3 years and your time at NAB, but before that, it's really interesting to hear that you worked for Qantas. I think a lot of people don't realize how versatile economics is and the amount of work that is out there. Can you tell us a little bit what a chief economist at Qantas or at an airline would do, and why is it that so many industries and so many different companies where we don't think an economist might work want to hire an economist? What can we bring to the table?
Well, I think firstly, economists do think differently about problem solving. We're taught differently. We're taught about marginal costs and marginal revenue and theories of how firms compete. So at Qantas, a lot of it, there was competition. Singapore Airlines was trying to get access to the Pacific, so there was a lot of competition-related issues there. I was really a macroeconomist when I joined Qantas, but I found there was a lot more micro, which I also learned at university, of course. Then there's a lot of price elasticity of demand. So when you're pricing airline tickets and yield management, so that typically has a lot of economics input as well. And your students and probably yourself would be experiencing how high airline airfares are at the moment. That's demand and supply and yield management. And then Qantas has a lot of financial exposures. It's got big exposures to oil, big exposures to the currency and to interest rates because it's got a lot of debt. So that's more the markets aspect, which has a financial or an macroeconomic aspect to it as well. So there's a sort of a mixture of all of those things.
Yeah, of course. It's nice to hear how applied it is and how you were able to bring in the macro and the micro together. Obviously, referring to demand and supply is important. I think it's the first model we learned, but by far the most powerful one there is, and super versatile, very easy to follow, and very useful across different areas. But you mentioned exposure to markets. So your current job at NAB is, of course, looking heavily into exposure to markets, and banks are very, very much exposed to markets, of course. So I wanna sort of start thinking about your current role, but to do that, I think might be a good idea to sort of think about the macroeconomy more generally. So why do you think, as a macroeconomist, why do you think the average person and the average business would need to understand things like inflation and interest rates and GDP growth and perhaps unemployment? Why would you tell, say, a smaller business, a medium-sized, and even a large business, hey, this sort of stuff's important?
One way or another, your business, any business, even universities that attract students from overseas, what is happening in the economy is very important. So if economies are in recession, then it's harder to find a job, there's unemployment, interest rates will tend to go down in that environment, inflation will fall, your business might be more challenged. Some businesses that are weak may go broke. So it's all interlinked. So I think when we're talking to our customers, we're trying to say what's really driving the economy at the moment. What will it mean for interest rates, which is important if you have debt, and particularly if you have a lot of debt.
Mm-hmm.
The inflation story, because central banks target low inflation, that the linkage between inflation and interest rates is very strong.
So speaking about inflation, in sort of the rich world, in sort of OECD member countries, we really haven't had very high levels of inflation today. And as I was saying earlier, I'm from Ecuador. We had hyperinflation in the 1990s, and I understand the costs. But I think a lot of people here don't really understand what it means to have very high inflation and what that can do. Can you, from the perspective of what you know inflation can do, can you perhaps tell us why you think central banks need to target inflation? Or do you think they've gone a little bit off the rails in that respect, and maybe they should be looking at something else or something broader?
Yeah. Look, I think if I just looked at the last 30 years when Australia's had low inflation, much of the world has had low inflation, it's actually been a very settled economy. Unemployment's generally come down. We've had long business cycles, which has helped unemployment come down. It's helped create wealth. It's helped reduce particularly unemployment, which is, I think, one of the most important challenges. So I think low inflation has been really good in that regard. It's been positive for society with reduced unemployment. High inflation tends to, in my view, distort investment decisions, and it doesn't reward savers, because if you're saving for a house, perhaps some of the young students will be thinking about doing that. The house price might be going up faster than you can save for it, and also if inflation's up 8% or 10% and your interest rate is 2%, you're going backwards compared to anything you can buy. So it's not good, I don't think, to have high inflation. That's my perspective. But given you had hyperinflation in Ecuador, perhaps you could give a good perspective of what really high inflation's like.
Yeah, look, it was a bit of a nightmare, to be honest. What happened at first was, firstly, the money in the bank is just worthless.
Yeah.
As soon as you get paid, you go to the shops sort of the next week, and that your wage is not worth that much in terms of goods and services anymore. That means that people start pulling money out of banks quickly. That leads to a typical Latin American crisis called bank run, which basically means banks lose all their capital, they run out of money. And the next step is people start buying whatever asset they can have, because holding cash is just not worth it anymore. One of the funny things I saw was, middle-class households beginning to buy the most expensive car they could possibly afford. So you suddenly saw a few nice cars around, because they thought this would hold value a little bit more. They couldn't afford a house, so I'll just buy a car. Cars depreciate by 25%, in the first year, so it's not a great
So
one.
all making the wrong sorts of signals and decisions.
Once you take away the ability, as you said, the value of savings from people, then it all really begins to just get really hard for them, and hard for businesses, hard for households.
You can't plan, you can't invest.
Yeah.
Interest rates presumably went up a long way. So
yeah, in fact, we ended up dollarizing We had to adopt the US dollar because our currency just couldn't hold it anymore. And that comes with cost as well, because you lose monetary policy. You don't have the ability to do what the Australian Reserve Bank is doing now. So yeah, it can be quite hard. But let's get back to your story. I think a lot of students doing their undergrad, and certainly when I was doing my undergrad, I would sort of want to get a crystal ball and think about what my future might be like. Given your experience, what do you think? What would you recommend that a student that wants to sort of focus on macroeconomics or be an economist more broadly? What do you think is what's the best advice you could possibly give them in terms of what to focus on and perhaps what to read, what to look at, what to be interested in, so that to fuel that passion a little bit more?
Yeah. Well, I find reading a lot of the information that the Reserve Bank of Australia puts out is very interesting, because you can see how they're thinking about the economy. When I went to uni, we didn't have the internet, so there is so much information out there. The Federal Reserve in the US does lots of speeches. You can watch them online, see what a very senior economist does. That's particularly macro focused, and it's a policy job. I love the book Freakonomics. I really like that. That's a bit more micro, but that's quite an interesting one to read, to see how people think differently about different challenges. So I think that's a good one, just to might stimulate some interest. I love reading the Financial Review every day and seeing what businesses are doing, and getting this sort of the micro of the macro economy, because the macro economy is the sum of all the businesses and consumers. So I like getting information that way as well. And, attend as many lectures as you can, do all your classwork. There's good intern programs that the banks run. NAB has an intern program. We've got graduate programs. And there's various competitions these days you can do. If you're into share markets, there's various different aspects you can look at. So yeah, there's lots of ways to get interested, I think.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's very valuable. I agree with you. I like reading broadly as well, and I would want to recommend Freakonomics as well. It's a fun read.
Yeah.
And there's other sort of little books out there, and for students, if they're ever interested, they can always just contact me and ask about that. But yeah, I totally agree with that. The broad literature, the fun stuff, the way the fun way of tackling important problems like unemployment, poverty reduction, as well as homelessness is really important, and there's some really clever ways of trying to do that, which is fantastic. I think a lot of students watching this might be thinking, gee, I want your job when I grow up, And what would you recommend for a student that's interested in working for NAB?
Well, there's quite a few different paths for a large bank. So I'm a macroeconomist for the bank, and typically we would hire people that have had training at the Reserve Bank or at the Commonwealth Treasury or a state treasury, by and large. But there are various finance degrees, there's or finance channels, there's risk channels. So one big part is managing the risk of the bank, whether it's the interest rate risk or the credit risk. So there's a variety of different ways you can go. It doesn't have to be pure economics. It could be finance. It could be accounting. So yeah, I think get a good degree, apply to the grad program, or if you want to be an economist, I think the best place to go is the Reserve Bank.
Great, thank you. And last thing, before we go, I just wanted to ask you, what's your favorite thing about economics?
Look, I think it's, in my job, it's a bit like being a detective. I'm trying to work out what's happening in the economy, and therefore, if I can work out what's happening there, then I can get an idea of what's going to happen to interest rates and other financial market variables that help my customers and help the bank manage its risks. So I get to, I guess, in part, I get paid to read the newspaper to get some of that on the ground experience. And the other really good part is I get to go out and meet lots of NAB's customers, whether they're the biggest corporations in the world or the biggest investment managers in the world, right down to small, medium-sized businesses and Australian farmers, and that's always interesting as well. I think you get to cross-check your big macro view with what businesses are actually experiencing. So I'm probably a little bit different to most macroeconomists. I'd say I'm more practical and more applied. We were talking earlier about job ads, which I love as an economic indicator. It's a really good indicator of what's happening in the economy, because in a bad economy or a poor economy.
Anyway, thank you, Ivan, very, very much for your time and for talking to me and virtually to our students, and hope to see you again, and hopefully you'll get some RMIT future grads working in your team.
That would be good.
Thank you.
Thank you.